Fate, Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 58 and 59. 58. By the Bonfire. 7. By the Bonfire. Social standing. We call them soapstones. Ash explained as Da Vinci looked over the crystal in her hand. They're used for setting down summoning signs so that we can transport between worlds. Really? Da Vinci hummed. So this is your summoning system. Looks a little less stylish than Mash's shield though. Aside from its physical appearance. He continued on, ignoring the jab at the summoning stone. The use is remarkably simple. You inscribe your name upon the ground and then wait for another unkindled to summon you across worlds. Can you summon yourself? I only ever witnessed Gale doing such things. Ash shook his head, and how he did so is beyond me. Although given your obvious interest in my belongings, Da Vinci grinned innocently, I decided that it would be best to show you our own summoning system, as I have already seen it used in a manner for communication within the Roman singularity. Ah yes, I remember. Da Vinci nodded. Sullivan made modifications so that you could send the image through, yes. Not so dissimilar to our own communication magecraft. Quite. Ash replied flatly, loath as he was to admit any good work of Sullivan, this was an exception. He wouldn't begin to attempt to understand the intricacies of modifying the spell work of the soapstones, and it had certainly benefited them when during the interference of communications. As well as keeping informed. Well. Da Vinci sat it down. This could certainly be useful to us. She paused, then shook her head with a wry smile. I say that, but it would be more than useful. A more streamlined service that would allow us to send servants down without the need to reshift them in. The summonings are not permanent. Ash explained. They only last so long as the danger is present. Even if you could implement it, they could only call upon a servant for a brief time. That works too. Da Vinci nodded her head, humming to herself. Calling servants down for only a brief time saves us the energy of having to reshift them in and out. Fujimaru can still his servants with him but would be able to briefly summon others to best suit the situation. I will not pretend to understand the magic behind it. That is because I am a genius. Da Vinci boasted, rather loudly, thumping a hand onto her chest. Even the complicated magics of other worlds are no match for my intellect. Ash gave an enthusiastic hum, causing Da Vinci to pout at him before she looked back at the box. Still, the magic to create a box which breaches upon imaginary number space would certainly be more useful to have. She admitted, would save us a lot of space when it came to storage. That is beyond me. Ash shook his head. You would need the aid of the likes of an incredibly talented sorcerer. He trailed off. A flash of hesitance entered his eyes, and most sorcerers of great talent were less than reputable. Clicking his tongue, he rested his hands on the table and leaned over it. Even if we found one that wasn't, there is still the issue of Havel. Da Vinci winced. Fujimaru-kun might be able to let our rocky berserker give him a chance, but getting him to leave the other sorcerers alone might present a greater hazard. He completed, although perhaps if we are lucky we could direct his hatred towards the less reputable mages, that might lessen his temperament. Still surprised he was actually able to form some manner of agreement with Havel. Da Vinci snorted, so am I. Although the director probably still has him on punishment duty for his rather reckless vacation of the room to rush over to a servant who actively hates mages. With luck, Havel can make a distinction between sorcerers and practitioners of spells. Ash hoped as he ran his hand through his hair, letting out a breath before he looked back at the self-proclaimed genius. Was there anything else you required of me? I had promised Arash that I would meet with him later. Da Vinci blinked at him. Why? He inquired as to whether I had a collection of bows. Ash sighed, shaking his head. When I confirmed that I did have some and was partial to using one at times, he wanted to hold a small competition. The unkindled gave a hapless shrug. I'm not very accurate when it comes to archery, as most bows I used were designed for covering an area around the target. I assume I called you away just before you started your little competition. The woman guessed as she nodded her head. Ash gave her a tiny grunt of affirmation. I suppose I should have expected that. She mused, shaking her head. Although I wouldn't hold out much hope of beating him. The genius gave a wry smile. Humble archer. He might be, but there is a reason he is regarded as a great hero of Persia. Knight of the Sun. Warrior of Sunlight. Don't be pedantic. Da Vinci chided without missing a beat. Effectively the same thing. Knight of the Sun or not, I'd still fancy his chances against yours, especially given your own penchant for swords. She reasoned before cupping her chin in thought. Although according to Gareth you seem to have quite a lot in common with Sir Gawain, and it's quite odd that your firekeeper apparently looked like King Arthur. She also looked like Nero. Ash pointed out with a flat expression, so I doubt I have much in common with the knight Gawain aside from physical appearance. Da Vinci hummed in response, well, there's a good chance you might one day meet him. Given that Fujimaru-kun will likely summon more servants in the future. I was under the impression that Olga was irritated at the quantity of servants. Ash remarked, frowning in puzzlement and tilting their head slightly, was I mistaken? No, was the immediate reply, but we're in for a penny at this point. The genius continued on as she threw her arms wide, might as well be in for the whole bank. Well, no concern of mine. Ash shrugged, Da Vinci rolled her eyes and gave him a patient smile. I'm sure that Fujimaru-kun won't replace you. She reassured him, the amused smile on her face only had the unkindled regard her with an indignant expression. You are his first properly summoned servant, so you'll always hold a special place in his heart. Quote. Why must you feel the need to phrase it so strangely? Ash tilted his head and thinned his lips. And yet you don't deny it. Da Vinci pointed out, her expression victorious as Ash stilled in surprise. His face soon morphing into one of apathy in the presence of her overwhelming enthusiasm. At least he thought it was enthusiasm, either that or it was a mass abundance of pride and ego in one's ability to be proven correctly. Ash was slightly concerned that perhaps he would find himself resting while others carried on. Although perhaps that was more his sense of duty as a warrior of sunlight to be as useful to his summoner and ensure they completed their quest. Perhaps there was also more to it. A feeling of investment in the success of their mission. His eyes crinkled, ignoring Da Vinci's person as they focused on something else. The woman noticed his sudden lack of attention and pouted before she saw the flicker of worry pass through his eyes. Oi! She reached out, poking his cheek and bringing his attention back to her. You're as much a part of the original crew as Mash is. I don't Fujimaru-kun would ever want to leave you behind as much as Mash would want to either. She smiled up at him, placing her hands on her hips. You've grown on them, just a little bit. Really? Ash pondered aloud, a slightly sheepish expression on his face as he reached up and scratched the back of his head. In truth Mash and Olga are the three I have known the longest, including the firekeeper. That's what happens when you spend more time with us than in your own world. Da Vinci pointed out before a sly smile came to her. I think everyone is right, you really are a child, aren't you? Ash leveled a thoroughly unimpressed look at her before he turned away, picking up his bottomless box and making for the door. Running away just proves I'm right. She called out with a barely concealed laugh. Ash didn't deign that with a reply as he quickly exited the room. Da Vinci watched him leave with the smile still on her face, slowly shaking her head before letting out a good-natured sigh. Honestly, you three. You're all of a piece. Archer had come to the conclusion that his master was a reckless fool. It wasn't a hard one to reach, and he shared the director's sentiment in berating him for the act of stupidity of walking into a room with a berserker who actively despised him to have an honest chat. However, he was still his master and there was little he could do about it save drill in the importance of his one life. Not that he probably needed to at this point. The director had the boy doing basic tasks and running repeated tests to better understand magecraft. While he knew his master was quite useless when it came to actually performing any of it, there was still the knowledge of what people were actually discussing around him so he could make informed decisions. You've got a thoughtful look on your face. Sigurd pointed out. Archer turned to the undead saber, because having a ghoul cooking your food wasn't bizarre in the least, and raised an eyebrow in questioning. The man saw his hidden question. I find it best to vocalize internal struggles when in company, it helps reach a solution. That implies there is an internal struggle, to begin with. He replied, looking back at the pan of omelette he was making. Besides, it's more of an external trouble and a sense of resignation. Oh. Sigurd hummed, how so? Master is an idiot. Aren't we all in some way? Was Sigurd's immediate reply, mixed in with a light-hearted chuckle, although I suppose his latest act is certainly one of certain bravery, or stupidity as Yorm would have so lightly put it. He mused, a nostalgic smile came to his face. He would have berated the boy and then run off and done something equally harebrained. So a hypocrite then. Archer huffed. HMPH. That much made sense. He once knew of an idiot who was of a similar sort. He was. The man nodded his head before a wry smile came to him, although I think being a giant allowed him some leeway when it came to ill-thought-out plans. Archer couldn't tell if the man mean giant, in the sense that they were tall, or giant in the sense they were a literal giant. He had long since come to the conclusion that the world that the others came from was one which had never left the age of gods, so phantomals and the like were still commonplace. He couldn't say it really impacted him all that much. Aside from a slight desire to increase his arsenal of weapons, it was always best to have more diversity, and while he certainly wasn't lacking in that regard, the mystic codes which had been discussed seemed to be of a far higher quantity than the ones he knew of. He'd already paid a brief look at the smith's wares. The enchantments and techniques certainly made the mundane steel of a higher quality, and they were quick to build apparently. The enchantments weren't anything complicated, but it was the power they had behind them that made them useful. He was certainly curious if he could turn the swords into arrows. He probably could through alteration. You're distracted. Sigurd chided in a playful manner. Archer blinked and pursed his lips. That wasn't a very becoming way for him to act. Especially when cooking, he might end up making a mistake. Anyway, I assume you were of the skeptical sort when it came to Havel's behavior. An understatement. Archer huffed. He actively despised his own master. Yes, that does present a slight issue. Sigurd admitted, nodding his head along and humming as he continued to stir away at the pot. Although I suppose it might be the madness clouding his mind. It is not a pleasant thought to hold. Grimacing, the knight shook his head. Losing oneself to the madness and to be summoned and remain in such a state, it is not pleasant to imagine. He hadn't really thought about it. Berserkers having low sense of reasoning was just the price they paid to be granted the extra strength. Ah, I suppose you might not see it the same way. The Onion Knight made a noise of understanding, turning to Archer and giving him a conflicted look, for we undead and unkindled. Sanity is quite a precious thing. It remains a struggle to keep yourself from hollowing. Unkindled have it easier as our duties are already made clear to us from the beginning, but that does not make it any more challenging. He shook his head. Imagine being risen from your grave and your only known thought when you first open your eyes is that you have to go out and slay a lord, and all you have on you is a broken old sword. Archer grunted in response, a daunting task to be sure. Quite so. Sigurd chuckled, shaking his head as a sad smile came to his face. Quite so. I suspect the burden proved so much for some. The graves where I was risen was already filled with hollows, those who abandoned all sense of purpose and lost themselves to madness. Archer knit his brows together. You dislike the berserker class because they remind you of these hollows. Is that a strange thing? Sigurd shrugged. No, I do not dislike them. I pity them. He lamented, moving back towards his own cooking station. I pity them for being summoned in such a way, and I am saddened they ever lose themselves to qualify for such a position. You shouldn't waste your pity on the dead. Archer scoffed. It won't change anything. I know. Sigurd nodded, but we're all dead now, we unkindled most of all. That the curse still clings to us even in this second life. He rested a hand over his heart, face contorted into a pain grimace, although perhaps that is the nature of our cursed existence. Eyes flickered back to Archer. Perhaps that boy can wrestle some semblance of Havel's sanity back from the brink. If he can, I will praise him with all my soul. And if he can't, then I can at least save Havel from himself. Sigurd looked away, as all unkindled do when we find hollows. It left little to the imagination what Sigurd meant when he said that. Archer studied him for a few moments before turning back to his cooking. Seems I underestimated you. He replied after a few moments of silence. I thought you were composed entirely of optimism. I am optimistic when it helps. Sigurd replied in a jovial tone. We can't be miserable all the time, so it is best to find what good humor we can. But there is a time and place to be joyous, and often it is a luxury to have. Looking over his shoulder towards the Archer, although you will find it an impossible task to ever have me lose that optimistic nature I cling to. Archer snorted. Yes, although at least you have some small sense of realism. That much is a commendable trait. You'll find few undead and unkindled who aren't burdened with realism. He chuckled. However, when your entire hold on sanity is based upon belief in oneself, you'll find few of my kind who don't have a healthy dose of optimism to them. It's what keeps us sane. Archer let out a slight chuckle. been the first time I've ever heard of an unhealthy dose of optimism keeping someone alive. Well, we unkindled like to break casts. Sigurd barked out a laugh as he thumped his chest. How else could we ever achieve a near impossible goal? Archer had to give Sigurd this. The man certainly had enthusiasm to spare, but it was a rare thing, tempered by a slight dose of realism. He always hoped for the best situation to unfurl but was never unprepared when the worst came about. That was how Archer pegged him now. It wasn't a bad mentality to have, and apparently it was the sort of mentality that kept you sane back where being jaded would leave you on the cusp of becoming insane. It sounded like a strange place every time someone spoke of it. A world where you were set an impossible goal and had to have an unrealistic level of stubbornness to believe you could achieve it. He flattened his expression. There would have been a fool once who would smile at such a world. He looked over to the only other two servants in the room with them at the time, Sir Gareth and Sir Vrindari, in quite an animated discussion over something, judging by the rather tense posture the Silver Knight had in comparison to the strained smile on the younger girl's face. Because it was an act of blinding foolishness. Vrindari sighed, resting his hands on his head. It does not make sense why he would put himself into harm's way like that for little to no reason. Maybe he just wanted to make friends with them. Gareth reasoned, tapping her hand on the table. Although I haven't actually met them, so I don't know all that much, think I should go and say hello. Vrindari's helm hid his expression as he hummed to himself. Perhaps, in truth I have not yet encountered the bishop either. He grunted, however I have only ever met one cleric in my life. To be fair. Gareth raised her hand. He probably didn't make that good an impression. I've heard some rumors swirling around that he wasn't all that cordial with the members of staff. I'm cordial with them out of necessity. Vrindari replied with an audible frown. The manner in which some of them treat my liege is most vexing. Gareth raised an eyebrow at him. Well, they are technically his superiors. Superior nothing. Vrindari shook his head. He is my liege and the one who will lead us through this campaign. He is due more respect than he is currently receiving. Pausing, the knight shook his head. Although perhaps I am too hasty, he is still inexperienced. I'm sure everyone will warm up to him eventually. Gareth tried to assure him. Maybe, she chuckled nervously, looking around and none too convinced by what she was saying. So, you ever take off the helmet? What? Vrindari tilted his head at the girl. Yes, sometimes when I need to eat. Really? How come I've never seen you with it off? I've never eaten around you is the very simple answer. He replied. Why do you ask? Just curious is all. Gareth shrugged. Never seen you without it on, so I just wondered what you looked like. You gonna take it off? No. Gareth pouted in response. Why not? The whine that escaped her didn't sound much like a 20-year-old girl, perhaps someone a little over half that age. Vrindari's inner thoughts must have been naked on his sleeve because of their way her eyes narrowed at him considerably, a suspicious frown forming on her face. You just thought I sounded childish, didn't you? Yes. Aren't you even going to deny it? She cried out in shock. That kind of thing can hurt someone's feelings. You're a knight. Vrindari pointed out. An anointed knight as well. Please behave with more maturity as suits your station. I would be remiss to think that your peers were as emotional as you. Hey. Gareth frowned. We were mature, sometimes, she trailed off and winced. Tristan sometimes was a little emotional at times. The strain on her face only grew, and Mordred was a little crude. These are your country's best knights. I hear that dismissal. Gareth frowned. What? None of your knights were like that. Aside from Sir Raim's unfortunate incident with the mimic chest, there was very little foolery on part of the king's guard. Vrindari stalwartly replied. It was a gathering of knights that were as honorable as they were dutiful. Gareth raised an eyebrow at him. Really? Because someone who manages to get their arms nearly bitten off doesn't sound like someone who was the picture of stoicism. He was too. Vrindari snapped. Sir Raim was the greatest knight of the kingdom. So what if he was branded a knight of treachery? He was still twice the man Velstad was. You have a knight of treachery too. Gareth blinked, tilting her head. That's what little sis Mordred was called as well. This Mordred was also a woman. Yeah, well, I know that now. Gareth waved her hand. Grail and all that, but gee, that's a surprise. Your king was a woman disguised as a man, you were a woman disguised as a man, and Sir Mordred was a woman disguised as a man. Verndari rattled off with a growing tone of bewilderment. How many of your country's knights were actually who they appeared to be? Quote. I'm sensing an accusation there. Gareth squinted her eyes at the man. So what if some of the best knights in the kingdom were women? Quote. How shall I put this? Verndari tapped his right hand on the table repeatedly as they thought up an answer. It sets an odd precedent when one discovers that most of their fighting force was made up of women in disguise. Gareth frowned at him before slamming her hands on the table and rocketing to her feet. We're going to the simulator. I'll show you. Odd precedent. You are being far too emotional. Verndari chided. I was just curious as to why so many of your high knights were women. He paused before continuing on, and why they weren't, well, tending to the households. Hey. Gareth huffed. I can fight just as well as anyone else. How many women were actually in your king's army? Quote. Does the king count? Quote. No. 3. No. 2, she muttered. Galahad has only just become a woman, So you had a grand total of 3 women in your army, including the king, and no more. He questioned. So, were women allowed in the army? Not, normally. Gareth admitted, it's why we had to disguise ourselves. So I am correct. Quote. Kind of. She moaned. Yes, we didn't normally let women anywhere near the front lines, also it wasn't acceptable. So why were you even there to begin with? Hey. Gareth frowned. I can be a knight if I want. I just preferred fighting in plate armor than wearing dresses. A faint blush came to her face as she tapped her fingers together and looked down at the table. Although if Sir Lancelot were to, she whispered to herself with a slightly giddy expression before she slapped her hands over her face. He couldn't, but what if he could? Quote. You weren't always like this around him, were you? No. Gareth sputtered. That would be incredibly distracting to him. A resigned smile came to her. Also, I don't think I'd be good enough for him anyway, even if he did notice me. Quote. Want to spar? He asked. I find it's a good way to distract myself from thinking problems. Quote. Sure. I thought I would find you here. I'm surprised you went looking. Fu turned and looked up at their visitor. A furry eyebrow was raised in tandem with the curious look they sent their guest. Not many would visit upon me regularly. Not many can understand me. Sif responded as they moved through the hallway, keeping pace easily with the small white animal. I suspect the same runs true for you as well. There are those that can. Fu admitted, then there are those that can't. I was actually surprised to meet one who could the last time the pair went down to the past. The one who smelt odd. Sif remarked, he acted strange within your presence as well, like when 2 predators meet. He's a smart one. Fu chuckled wryly, and he could see me, or at least the true form of me behind this thin veneer of fluff. Sif gave an amused laugh in response. To all others it sounded like a series of whines, as their hazel eyes flicked down onto the beast. Although I admit, there is something strange about you. Appearance aside. Don't mention it. Fu commanded, I won't be pleased. I have no intention of it. The wolf responded easily, it is your own wish to assume this form, so I will not force a choice from you, although I do question the reasoning behind this appearance of yours. A perverted asshole. Fu bitterly remarked, although it has its uses, they are unsuspecting of what I really am. That's fine with me. I imagine your ability to be held in the young girl's bosom is entirely circumstantial then. Sif innocently replied. Fu paused and looked up at the larger animal with a what amounted to a glare. To all others it was adorable, to Sif it was a clear warning. I admit some slight jealousy, but my fur has managed to attract the attention of fair maidens just as easily. Which he ignored with an amused tone of voice. Fu growled and resumed his pace with the wolf, although perhaps that is some slight inclination from my master. Artorias did always have an eye for women. Quote. Have we really been turned into perverts by a pair of womanizers? Fu wondered aloud. That's rather sad to think about. I would hardly put myself on the same rank as Artorias. Sif argued with an indignant tone. I just enjoyed the way they tended to my fur, one of the few advantages of being large. I'm nowhere near as fiendish as that flower bastard. Fu snorted with the same tone, but if they hold you in their chest you feel a great deal of warmth. You can't do that because you're so big. I suppose, Sif admitted, this is actually my form from when I was much younger, my actual size was considerably larger than this. What a coincidence, same here. Fu replied. Then again, my form is likely far more terrifying. Although I am more curious as to where you get this seemingly boundless confidence to be so brazen with me. Brazen. Is that how it appears? Sif pondered before shaking their head. Nothing so insulting, considering neither of us are capable of holding conversations with others as fluently as we are now. I just thought it best to be on good terms with my only other bestial companion. Bestial, Fu snickered, quite perceptive, but that does not answer my question all that well. Sif came to a halt, their eyes glazed over. There is one thing I fear above all others. Perhaps this aura of primal murder you emanate can come close, but compared to that thing it is still tolerable. Really? Fu titled their head and let out a curious hum. Must have been quite the instinct to outpace me, although I am only in this little form. I suppose it isn't a fair comparison right now. They paused and let out a dry huff. Comparison. Hey. It is. Have you ever seen the darkness of humanity? Sif questioned. Fu raised an eyebrow, their most base feelings given form. Their souls laid bare before you and incarnated in a single being. I know a lot about people. They replied, I have a great understanding of their rather nasty feelings towards competition. You could say it feeds me. Then you would have drowned in its presence. Sif replied, or gorged yourself to your fill, I know not which. That freak who thought to manipulate the abyss barely reached an iota of what it was. And what was it? It fathered the abyss. Sif growled, looking away from Fu and back down the hallway. A beast of humanity. Those are some strong words. Fu pointed out, and they probably have a completely different meaning to you than everyone else. They went on before they released a curious grunt, but I'm curious, and perhaps feeling a little competitive now, what became of it? They were slain by one such man. Sif replied. The one who could achieve what even my master could not. I know not where they came from or how, but they appeared just as quickly as they left. The beast was slain and my master's soul put to rest. Touching. Very. Sif snorted, but until you reach the level of the Abyss Father, I have little reason to fear you more than them. That and you're far more reasonable than they are. I'm not reasonable, just a lot more tolerant. There is a marked difference. They pointed out, and it is quite reliant on the innocence of one young girl. Her innocence, and her warmth. Ye know. Fu growled, their innocence. I'm not a pervert like that flowery prick. Ha ha ha. Sif laughed as they plodded down the hallway, Fu following after them and continuously spouting off rather half-hearted arguments of protest. The simulator was already in use by the time the two arrived. Gareth and Vrindari looked at each other before the knight pressed the button on the wall next to the door. Slight hiss of air indicated the door opening upwards to reveal the interior. Just say that if you're accurate enough, you don't really need a bow that big. Arash pointed out with his hands raised in mock surrender, but I suppose if it's just area of effect it doesn't really matter all that much. He admitted, what did you even call it? Onislayer Greatbow. Arash blinked, you guys had Oni. It's just what the Far East call demons. Ash waved his hand, slotting in a very large arrow into the steel cord and pulling the bow back as he aimed at the target. They also made the katanas as well. That's a bit of a coincidence. Arash mused as he turned back to the range. Far East have the same kind of stuff here too. Really? Ash hummed in response, I have noticed some coincidences of shared names thus far. Suppose it is just a different Earth after all. Arash shrugged, some themes have to remain the same. Possibly. Ash admitted. Quote. No, that does seem rather odd for a coincidence, doesn't it? Lowering the bow, he turned to the archer and quizzed with a bewildered look. Arash let out a sigh of relief. You as well. He chuckled, shaking his head. I thought it was just me but I wasn't going to comment on it. Imagine the odds that both of our Far Eastern countries end up calling demons, Oni, and making katanas. That's just a really weird coincidence. Did yours have big horns on their head? Arash asked, pointing towards his own forehead in questioning. Shrugging in response, Ash answered, I never met one or heard of it beyond the bow itself. So I couldn't answer. Huh. Weird. Quite so. Ash planted the bow back into the ground and pulled the large arrow back. The cord groaned and metal creaked at the strain he put on it before he loosened the arrow. The giant arrow shot across the range and slammed into the target. The simulation shattered into splinters and sent debris shooting off in a buckshot as the arrow continued on and slammed into the ground. Quote. Seems a bit overkill, doesn't it? Arash replied as he looked the bow up and down. Also, it's really quite large. No. You couldn't fire it that quickly, I don't think. I believe the idea was that you kill it on the first shot. Ash replied as he lowered the giant steel bow and turned back to Arash. Either that or you cripple it long enough to ensure you can draw a second arrow. Well, the Persian looked to the remains of the target. I suppose the results speak for themselves. He chuckled as he brought out his own bow, but, well. He drew back an arrow, steadying his breathing and loosening it. The arrow shot through the field with a burning flame emanating from the tip before it smashed into the center of the bullseye and destroyed the wooden simulation. Sometimes bigger isn't always better. Quote. Show off. Ash grunted with a good-natured smile. Arash gave him a playful roll of the eyes. Sure, just out of curiosity, how many noble phantasms and other assorted trinkets you got in that box of yours? His smile widened at the faint smile he got along with a slight shake of the head. Soon pausing, the archer looked over his shoulder towards the entrance to see Gareth and Vrindari stood there. The archer waved his hand and called out to them, "Don't be too shy, just wanted to test out something." Ash looked in the same direction as the man and spotted the two. "Sir Vrindari, Sir Gareth." He nodded his head to them. "I didn't realize you would be visiting." An attempt at a brief respite. Vrindari replied stoically, "I had heard of the stores of item boxes, but it is another to see one for myself. A small armory, no. Something like that." Ash admitted, looking down at Gareth. "Still, surprised to see both of you here. Wanted to finish our spar." She replied, "Couldn't really complete it in Rome, so figured it would be best to find a winner." Pausing, a playful smile came to her face as she pointed at Vrindari. "If I win, you have to take off the helmet." "I take it off when I eat." Vrindari pointed out, "But I suppose if it shall grant you incentive I can play along with this childish notion of yours." Quote. Sir Lancelot is better than Sir Rame. Slander. Vrindari reacted on instinct, drawing his sword and slamming it into her manifested shield. Gareth jumped back with force of the blow to increase the distance between the two of them with a smile on her face. Hunching herself over and flashing her gun lance into existence in her free hand. Quote. I have embarrassed myself. The Looking Glass Knight lamented as he brought out his own shield. Although I could say you did that on purpose to elicit a reaction. Gareth shrugged. "It was a very Mordred thing of me to do," she replied easily before frowning. "Although I still think Sir Lancelot is better. And I believe Sir Rame is better." Vrindari answered, a slight hint of amusement in his tone. "Until our two teachers duel, I suppose we shall never receive an answer." Grinning, Gareth cocked her lance back. "I suppose I can represent Sir Lancelot's training here and now." Vrindari chuckled, his body pulsing with white lightning. "That much is try, I suppose. We shall see which knight's teachings are stronger." He kicked off the ground, rushing towards the smaller lancer with his sword swinging in overhead. Gareth let out a cry as she charged forwards, thrusting her lance at the mirror shield. Ash and Arash watched the two being to duel with similar looks of amusement. "So who do you think will win?" the archer asked. "Difficult to say." Ash replied, "Sir Gareth is faster, but Sir Vrindari probably has the edge in endurance. His shield is more suited to taking blows than hers." "Fair enough." Arash nodded his head. "You ever seen what he looks like without his helmet?" "No." Ash frowned. "What about you?" "Can't say I have either." Quote. Now I am mildly rooting for Sir Gareth to win just to answer that query. Same. And, next time, we charge off into the oceans to fight pirates, Argonauts and whatever else is lurking around in the depths. Pack your snorkels and your air tanks. We're about to get our feet wet. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 58. Wet Feet. Bushes parted quickly as the armored figure burst through them, sprinting as fast as they could through the greenery with little regard for whatever was in front of them. The shrubs he passed through were upturned when the second figure, much slower than the first, passed through in their wake, looking over their shoulder while breathing heavily. The pair continued their mad sprint through the woods. The first man released a grunt of exertion as they threw themselves down an embankment. Their feet touched the ground first with a heavy thud before they kicked off and resumed their run. The second man jumped down and slammed into the ground hard, losing their footing and rolling over. Heaving themselves up, they cast a single glance over their shoulder towards the top of the drop before they scrambled back to their feet and took off after the other one. Bursting into the open, the first armored man passed through the edge of the forest and into the sunlight, sliding to a halt and kicking up a small cloud of sand as they stopped, casting their sight across the expanse of water before them as they slowly turned their head until they caught sight of it on the shoreline. The sail ship still ashore when it was departed. Spinning around at the sound of rustling bushes, they caught sight of the second man part through the trees, panting heavily as they looked over their shoulder. "Dee-doo," they exhaled. "Do you think we lost them?" "No." The first one remarked darkly. "They can still sense me, they won't stop." Then we will have to make a stand." The second man affirmed, sounding nervous about the prospect, their hand resting on the pommel of the straight sword sheathed on their hip and their grip on the shield in their left arm tightening. "I will." The figure corrected, moving towards them and reaching towards the small box mounted on their side, flipping the lid up and holding their hand above the chest. "You will have to get this away from them." They instantly shook their head. "I cannot." Holding up their hand, "You are more fit for such a task and a far more worthy defender of it than I, you should go." Shaking their head, they pulled their hand away from the box as the golden light began to coalesce into a shape. "I can try and stop them, but I will most certainly not survive, and if I die there is nothing to stop them getting their hands on this." They raised the item and forced it into the man's arms. Their helmet hid their expression, but the feeling of reluctance was obvious. "You once set me on a quest. Allow me to do this for you." "It was a quest one myself could not complete." They argued back. "I have not the strength that you hold, should you fall." "Should I fall? They will be far too injured to maintain a chase." Cutting him off, they released their hold on the object and allowed it to fall completely into their hands. The armored figure clutched it tight to their chest to avoid dropping it. Their head looked over his shoulder and towards the edge of the forest. "Now you must go. Quickly, I will delay them as long as I can." I will do as you ask." The man sullenly replied, moving past them and towards the ship, "But I confess, I do wish I had the confidence in myself that you seem to have in me. I have confidence in the man who braved an asylum guarded by demons on the word of an ancient prophecy." An ancient prophecy which turned out to be missing key details. Came the mirthless chuckle. "I could not even pass on the correct message." "You did enough." Their head darted back to the forest as bushes began to rustle. "Now go. Quickly now and do not look back. You hold the fate of all of us in your hands, Oscar. I wish you ever fortunate blessing that you will succeed." "I wish you fortune as well, Lord Bedrick." Oscar replied with a respectful nod. "I'm not a lord." Bedrick chuckled in response, pulling out a great sword made of chiseled obsidian stone-like material. The top of the blade jutted backwards in a slight hook. "Just one who was in the right place at the right time." Oscar silently turned away and sprinted towards the boat, waving his hands towards the other figures atop as ran, jumping off the beach and onto the boat before they leapt back and began to push from the front, digging their feet into the ground and letting out a cry of exertion as they gradually freed the boat from the grip of the sand, pushing it back into the water before they climbed up the side of the ship and boarded it. Bedrick let out a sigh of relief as he watched the sails of the boat turn and the ship begin to break away from the shoreline, still far too close for his comfort, but the choice appeared to have been taken out of his hands. The bushes behind him rustled as the sound of thump against the sand indicated the arrival of their pursuer. "I would ask if your compatriots had abandoned you," they called out in a cordial tone of voice, "but that would be insulting towards them. I assume you sent them away so they would not be harmed in the clash." "Quite so." Bedrick nodded, turning around and facing his soon-to-be opponent. "I know not why you want it, but what you seek is beyond your reach. For now." They dismissed with a lazy wave of their hand, claiming it from you now or from them makes no difference to me. All that really changes is the time I have to put into it. Although I imagine you will try to stop me here and now, why else would you forego the only escape route available to you? You suppose I require an escape? Bedrick replied fiercely, their grip on their sword tightening as they moved their other hand towards the talisman on their waist. What makes you so confident that I will not slay you here and now? Truthfully. They titled their head in response and let out a mild chuckle. There are few who can actually kill me anymore, Bedrick, Lord of Cinder. Raising an eyebrow behind their helmet, Bedrick tilted their head slightly. I have no recollection of gifting you my name. So how do you know of it? Haha, a knowing laugh escaped their throat as the white orbs shone from beyond the visor of his helmet. We'll just say that I am uniquely qualified to understand my opponents as of late. Still, you all took off the moment you saw me, that was quite rude. I admit I didn't make the most grand of entrances. You think I would parry words with one who so frolics in the abyss? Bedrick scoffed. You are either a madman or a fool. Narrowing his eyes, they leveled their sword at the figure. Either that, or you are corrupted. The figure remained silent for a few moments before they replied in a warm voice, poor child. They really sunk their claws so deeply into you. As if linking with our denied nature was somehow the ugliest sin you could commit. It is like saying a fish who swims has been corrupted by water. Shaking their head, their hand flipped open the lid of their own box as it materialized on their waist. The dark soul has been treated so poorly, is it any wonder it lashes out? To see its true warmth, you need only hold out a hand of friendship. They paused and looked up at them. I could hold out that hand to you, if you wanted. And I would swat it away. Bedrick fired back instantly, not even taking a moment to consider the offer and grimacing behind their helmet. You offer a hand of friendship coated in poison and your words are as appealing. The sun too is grossly incandescent for those who find beauty in it, but even they would not gaze upon it forever. Quote. A shame. The man replied with a shrug, although that does not change my opinion of you in the least. Perhaps you believed that throwing yourself onto a pyre was the best way to save humanity because you knew no alternative. Kov spoke similar words of choice. Bedrick scoffed. The kings of New Londo paid heed and their city is lost to ruin. I will hear no more of your delusions. So be it. Their hand pulled away from their box as a sword began to form in their grasp. The shape twisted and coiled around itself before it elongated to form the shape which had Bedrick white in his eyes. That is, their heads snapped back to the man. What have you done? They whispered in a hushed voice of horror. I opened up the door for a new humanity. They replied, a better humanity. The sword burst into life with brilliant white flames which danced across the blackened metal of the sword, but I suppose we have bantered long enough. Come then, Bedrick of Lordran. Let us see the strength of the first human Lord of Cinder. It's not that I didn't understand who I was to begin with. Even without my memories I knew who I was. I knew what I was. Even before he said it, I could understand. It was like there was inscription on my soul itself. We unkindled are worthless. Hawkwood was crestfallen, he was just waiting until the flame faded away. I figured that out quick but I can't say he was wrong. No. Perhaps he was right. I had my duty to fulfill, but how does one kill a god? I didn't even know that. I had expectations piled atop me from the very beginning and I all knew was that I was worthless from the beginning. It doesn't matter how many times I fight, how many times I win, how many times I kill. I understand it from the very beginning. We unkindled are worthless. Maybe I'm not worthless in the way that Hawkwood thought of. But perhaps there are other ways of having no value. How can you say your life is valuable to anyone? When you only exist only to die. Ritska groaned as they rubbed their eyes, sitting up in their bed and letting out a yawn. His dreams were really starting to get weird now, first with visions of being in a classroom and now too, wherever he was. It looked like a graveyard. He grimaced as he blinked repeatedly, focusing his vision and looking around his room. Yep, definitely back in his room. His eyes drifted towards his side. Looking down the right-hand side of the bed they let out a slight breath of relief as they noticed that there was no sign of Kiyohime this time, perhaps she had forgotten. Probably got stopped by someone. He decided was the more likely scenario, like she would forget. She'd been quite determined. Fu. Hey Fu. Ritska nodded to the small creature curled up on the end of his bed. The animal stretched itself out and let out a wide yawn before shaking itself and scratching behind the ear. He still had no idea whether Fu was some kind of magical cat or magical dog. Unless. Hey, Fu. Q. Are you some kind of magic fox? Quote dot dot dot. Fu. Ritsuka shrugged. Take that as a no, then. He sighed, throwing his legs over the side of his bed and stretching his arms backwards and forwards. Think the director is gonna have me doing more punishment duties today? He asked the small animal. Fufu. The white squirrel creature replied, before letting out a mocking, Q. Ritsuka narrowed his eyes at the response, that had all the hallmarks of being a, that's what you get for being stupid, type of reply. He could see it in the little beady eyes of the animal. Laugh it up. He rolled his eyes, pushing himself to his feet. I didn't really want him to go without giving him a chance. It just doesn't feel right. QQ. I'm going to assume you're agreeing with me and call it a day. Ritsuka chuckled to himself as he made his way towards his drawers. I wonder if Da Vinci can make an animal translator or something just so we can understand what you're saying. He pondered to himself before he turned and looked over his shoulder at the small animal as it hopped off his bed. Would you like that? Fu. They gave him a dismissive look and he could swear there was a hint of an eye roll from them. Ritsuka shrugged. Suppose if she could, she would have done so earlier. He heard a knock of his door. Both he and Fu looked towards it and then back to each other. Fu staring at him expectantly. I'm in my boxers, Fu. I'm not going to answer the door like that. Do you think Senpai is awake? Mash asked, looking up towards the unkindled stood next to her with their arms crossed. I am not entirely sure. Ash replied with a shrug, we could always enter. That seems as though it would be a breach of privacy. The girl replied with an uncertain frown, but if he is still asleep then the director might get mad that he missed the briefing. Again. She bit her lip, debating whether or not she should open up the door or try and knock again. The choice was taken out of her hands when the door slid open. Ritsuka appeared in a pair of shorts and a black top, leaning through the door with his arms bracing on either side as he stared at the two of them. I didn't oversleep, did I? His voice containing a hint of anxiety. Mash shook her head, somewhat relieved she didn't have to risk embarrassing the master. No, Senpai. It's just about the right time for you to get up. Dr. Roman says we've located another singularity. Ritsuka's eyes widened. Better get changed proper then, He chuckled wryly. Any idea where? So, it's the ocean. Ritsuka bluntly put as they stared at the map. Just, the ocean. Yeah, Romani scratched the back of his neck and have a hollow chuckle. It's not really all that precise. It's just a place we can say is here, and that's about it. We've got several islands scattered about the location so it's not as if it's all ocean. He gestured to the small readings, but it's not all that specific. That's because the geography of the islands continually shifts. Olga explained as she stared at the map. It is corresponding with a singularity and the changes in magical energy, so it cannot be said to be a natural phenomena. So, go into the ocean, find out what we're supposed to solve and then leave. Ritsuka surmised with a hopeful smile. It can't go that wrong. What year is it by the way? 1573. Romani provided helpfully before a slight frown came to his face. Do you happen to get seasick? I mean, Ritsuka shrugged. I don't really know. I haven't been on the ocean all that much. I'm still confused on the difference between an ocean and a lake. Ash remarked with a slightly bewildered expression. Is there a difference? He looked around the room to see the blank faces of everyone else, save Mash who seemed to be staring at him in some veiled form of kinship. An ocean is much larger than a lake, Ash-san. Mash explained. According to data, 71% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. Quote dot dot dot. Is that a lot? Yes. Mash nodded then furrowed her brows. You said that the first time you ever saw a beach was when we chased after the missing supplies, yes. Ash nodded his head. Was that also the first time you ever saw the ocean? Ash nodded his head with an innocent look on his face. We didn't really get much water in Lothric. There was the river then ran outside of Irithyll but that was up to my knees at its height. He paused and tilted his head. Is an ocean deeper than that? Quote dot dot dot. It is, Ash-san. Mash nodded her head. I haven't been on the ocean either, so it will be a new experience for both of us. She cheered with a small amount of enthusiasm which had Romani give a faint smile and Ritsuka look around the room with a slightly confused expression, taking note of the way the director pointedly avoided looking at Mash. We discuss your saber's lack of experience in bodies of water later. Olga interrupted with a slight edge in her voice. wanting to also get away from the subject of Mash's ignorance as well. For now, you would be best heading down to the rayshift chamber along with whatever servants you intended to bring with you while Romani inputs the coordinates. Quote. You're not gonna drop us into the sea, are you? Ritska joked, which caused Romani to let out a squawk of indignation and which turned into a pitiful whine at the glare he received from Olga, who was still bitter about materializing hundreds of feet in the air, while Da Vinci rolled her eyes. That was one time. Roman argued, we were trying to fight through interference. You can't blame me for singularity mischief. Da Vinci pat him on the back with a faint smile. There, Romani. The way in which she sounded as though she was reassuring a child only earned a whimper from the man. Still smiling, she looked to the trio. In any case, I've made something especially for the you. A Da Vinci patented present? Ritska asked with a raised eyebrow, earning an enthusiastic nod from the woman. Reaching into one of her pockets, she proceeded to whip out a small gray tube and thrust it into the boy's hands. Ta-da! She grinned, it's a floaty. Quote. This isn't inspiring a lot of confidence in me right now. Ritska remarked as he stared at it, then shrugged and gave a grateful smile to the genius. Still, better to have it and not need it, right? That's the idea. Mash frowned. I still have several concerns. She looked to see the director now looking impatient and nodded her head in resignation. But I don't think we have the time to address all of them. Turning to Ritska and Ash, she put on a determined face. Let us prepare to depart, Master, Ash-san. Quote. Well, there were a couple errands I wanted to. Ritska spoke before Mash placed her hands on her hips and cut him off. You can leave the errands until we get back, senpai. Ha. Romani laughed. Mash really is the type to take charge. Fujimaru-kun is getting henpecked. Mash froze on the spot and widened her eyes. Wait, that was. Shut up, Roman. Olga sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. Just get moving, the lot of you. All right. Ash nodded his head, turning around and taking a single step forwards before he noticed the small ball of white fluff sat near the entrance to the room. The two stared at each other for a second before Ash turned around and pointed at Fu. Are we taking them with us as well? May as well. Ritska shrugged and walked towards the animal. Come on, Fu. He held out his arms expectantly. Fu looked at him as if he were an idiot before they jumped over him and landed on Mash's chest. The girl let out a small eep of surprise before the animal scrambled up and made itself comfortable on her shoulder. Ritska stood frozen for a few seconds before he slowly lowered his arms, staring ahead with an emotionless look on his face. All right then, was all he said before he quickly departed the room. Mash stared at his retreating figure before she took after him. Wait, senpai. I'm sure Fu was just being a little picky. Don't be too sad about it. Ash watched her leave before a cough had him look over his shoulder. The director stared at him with a slightly raised eyebrow. Yes. I shall assume you are incapable of swimming. What's swimming? Oh my goodness. Romani muttered as his head fell into his hands. Da Vinci bit her lip and looked away from the unkindled while struggling to decide whether to laugh at what he said or outright feel bad about his obvious lack of knowledge. Quote. Fine. Olga sighed. Avoid falling in the water then. If Fujimaru has to use a command seal to drag you out of a watery grave, I will be most displeased. Oh. Ash nodded his head. Yes, drowning is a terrible way to die. Olga gave him a slightly hesitant look, spoken from experience. Oh, yes. He nodded his head. I was curious how far the Irithyl River went. I wasn't expecting the drop. Without even waiting to see the reaction his words had, he turned around and made his way out of the room, closing the door behind him. Quote. Seems a very runabout way of telling someone to be careful, doesn't it? Da Vinci pondered aloud while sending the director a tiny smirk. The pale-haired woman responded with a flat look and a huff. We're going to the ocean. I don't know how much experience you guys have with that kind of stuff. He explained as he looked around the servants gathered in the rayshift chamber. Just for, a warning. He very pointedly looked towards the rather tall servant stood at the far end of the lineup. Havel didn't respond, save a grunt. Okay. Ritska whispered to himself before clapping his hands and facing the other two. So. Any questions? Archer and Boudica regarded him with blank stares in response. Cool. Ritska nodded. See you in a moment. He made his way over to his coffin while the other servants all looked at each other. Ash looked up at Havel while the latter looked down at the much smaller saber. Quote. I'm a pyromancer. Ash began. I assume there is no problem. Quote. No. Havel grunted in response, shifting his club on his shoulder and tightening his grasp on his shield. Ha. Te, wa, tear. Have you ever seen an ocean before? Why? He paused. Why, oh you. Not until recently. Ash shrugged. Still an odd thing to contemplate, all that water just lying there. Quote. Used to it was all Havel offered as they waited patiently for the ray-shifting procedure to begin. No. Chia, l. Would it be alright if I questioned the wisdom of having one of the heaviest servants near water? Boudica whispered to Archer. The tanned servant gave a faint snort in response, because it seems like a bad idea. You could raise it, but I doubt he'd listen. Archer responded with a quiet sigh and a small shake of his head. Regardless, I suspect it relates in some part to whatever agreement those two managed to reach. Anything short of a command seal probably wouldn't deter them. Unsummon program, start. The announcement boomed across the chamber, cutting short whatever else they had to say as Ritska and Mash entered their coffins. The other servants stood around outside in a small group. Spiritron conversion, start. The lights above their head began to flicker and intensify in power as the start-up sequence completed itself, counting down to rayshift in 3, 2, 1. A brilliant light engulfed the room and disappeared just as quickly, leaving the entire room empty. They're on their way now. Carrie tapped away at her monitor. Vitals are looking good, they'll materialize in 10 seconds. Spinning around, the woman offered a slight shrug and a half smile. Never rayshifted into an ocean before, but, hey. What could go wrong? Well, they're doomed. Munier remarked almost instantly, shaking his head and releasing a sigh. Whenever you say something like that, it's always bound to go wrong. That's superstition. Carrie waved her hand dismissively, turning back to her monitor. They'll be fine. A smirk came to her face. See. Vitals are all good and they materialized safe and sound. Quote. Hey. Maxwell squinted his eyes at his own monitor. Is the altitude measurement supposed to be that high? Quote. Oh shit. Alright. Romani spoke up with a slightly anxious voice. New plan. We don't tell the director. Don't tell me what. The door behind him opened up as the woman entered the room with a resigned frown on her face. How have you managed to bungle the situation this time? Bungle? Who? Me. Romani nervously laughed, looking away and scratching the back his neck, and never. Right guys. He looked around the room for support. The others knew that if Romani got in trouble, they would be quick to follow considering it was a team effort. Yeah, absolutely, no problems. Were the three uniform replies. Olga narrowed her eyes suspiciously at them before she allowed a pleased smile to come onto her face. Finally. Some competence around here. She puffed out her chest with a smile. I was beginning to worry that we were becoming too lax when it came to procedures given our recent string of problems, but I am glad to know that we're still able to operate with a degree of professionalism. The other coffin officers made it a point not to look her in the eyes. It was crisp blue sky, barely a cloud in sight. The only true noises to be heard were the gentle lapping of waves disturbing the surface of the water and the gentle whistling of the breeze. Ah! Completely offset in a single instant as a half a dozen figures plummeted through the sky towards the surface of the water at breakneck speeds, the rayshift having somehow deposited them, yet again, hundreds of feet in the air. Ritska and Mash were the closest to the ocean, although still a good 100 meters away, with the young boy screaming as best he could and flailing his arms through the air in an almost comical sight of attempted flight. Unfortunately for Ritska, he couldn't really see the humor in the situation all that much. Archer and Boudica came next, the latter having a slightly panicked look on her while the former held only mild surprise which quickly fizzled out into one of resignation. Then came Ash and Havel. The bishop fell in silence while the saber was merely experiencing an odd sense of déjà vu. It wasn't difficult for him though, considering he had died this way more times than he could count, although he did feel a great reluctance to die in this manner again. Havel was more concerned with the landing. Mash streamlined her body into an arrow, Earlier experience of this situation with Patches had given her some small idea of how to handle this type of situation, and aimed herself at Ritska. Accelerating towards him, only just noticing Fu clinging to his back with their claws embedded in the fabric of their shirt, she reached out with her hands and tackled him midair. Hang on, senpai. Mash clutched Ritska tight against her body as she held out her hand in front of her, shield springing into being as they fell towards the ocean. Only just noticing the distant figure of a ship near their landing site. Hey. Yeah. Y'all ever wonder why we're out here? The man took in a single sniff of the air before he answered. Compass broke, Pete. He shrugged. Why we're out here. Right. Pete nodded along. I get that, but, what were we looking for anyway? Treasure. Bomb shrugged. I don't know, boss just said it was out there, ya know. You're the one with the map. Pete shrugged. Also boss is just good at findin' stuff. That's why they're the boss. Bomb waved his hand, then paused and frowned. Ya hear something? What? Pete titled his head. Nah, I don't hear nothing. It's I don't hear anything. Bomb corrected, sayin' you don't hear nothing means you heard something double negative or so the boss says. Quote. Boss is surprisingly articulate, ain't they? See how come you can say something like that? Ah. Bomb was cut off by a scream and then a rather loud splash of water. Everyone else on the deck of the ship paused in their duties and turned their head in the direction of the sound. Bomb and Pete shared a look before they rushed over to the starboard side of the ship and peered over the edge of the railings. They then noticed the rather large disturbance on the water where something had fallen into it. What in the hells? Bomb began, only to catch sight of another blur of something crash into the water, swiftly followed by another blur of a red coloration. It raw and men or something. He looked up and caught sight of two more vague shapes in the sky accelerating towards them. The closest one came into proper form. The men on the ship managed to gleam out a man in steel armor wearing blue fabric around his body falling through the air towards their boat. Hey. Pete squinted his eyes. Is it me, or does it look like they're gonna? He sucked in air through his teeth when the armored man slammed face first into the upper support of the sail and bounced off it, flipping through the air and then face planting the water with a meaty thud before they sank into the murky blue. Oof. Bomb and several other crew members displayed similar reactions before their eyes fell on the final figure. Bomb himself blinked incomprehensively. That a statue. The statue itself crashed into the water just off the port bow of the ship with an enormous explosion of water which kicked up a nearly 4-meter tall blast over the railings and onto the deck. Quote. Think this ever happened to the boss? Pete asked Bomb, the slightly tanned man wearing a red bandana around his head and a black patch over his left eye rolled his jaw before he gave a shrug. Don't know, that whole mess with that big guy recently ain't all that good. He turned back to Pete. Still weird. The water rippled violently before a large inflatable raft burst through and into the open, expanding out rapidly and revealing the rather wet forms of Ritska, Mash and Fu, the former coughing up and looking rather miserable while Mash held a slight grimace on her face. What? Ritska spat out another mouthful of salt water before they continued on. What the heck was that? He darkly remarked. Mash was likewise troubled by their materialization in the middle of the air and above the ocean. I don't know, senpai. She offered, rubbing his back as he continued to cough up his guts. Another problem with the ray shift perhaps. She tried to explain away, although this would have marked the second time someone materialized in the air. Still rubbing the master's back, she looked up and froze at the sight of a ship full of poorly dressed individuals staring at them from above, as senpai. She began to push him slightly to get his attention. Why yeah. He turned around to face, seeing the slightly concerned expression on her face as she raised her other hand and pointed. Look. Ritska turned his head to see the ship full of what he could only describe as pirates being a captive audience to him. Well. Ritska sniffed. Think they'll give us a ride? Wait. He paused and looked around. Where's everyone else? Mash similarly froze before her eyes went wide. Ash-san can't swim. Ritska widened his eyes as that train of thought. Havel won't even be able to float. The hell? Bomb squinted at the pair in some manner of yellow thing. The boy was dressed in some odd white outfit that looked quiet expensive while the girl was wearing steel armor. It wasn't exactly the most normal of pairs. What is this? Don't know. Pete shrugged and turned to Bomb. What do y'all wanna do? Well, May as well steal their valuables. Baum answered with a nod of his head, they're bound to have Somethi woe. The man stumbled as the ship abruptly jerked and began to heavily lean to the port side. The wooden planks near the anchor drop began to creak dangerously as the metal chains began to pull downwards and cause the ship to roll. What the? Baum righted himself and turned around. What's happening? Something's caught the anchor. One of the crew members shouted back. Can't reel it in. The man paused and trailed off, blood leaving his face and causing his expression turn into one of pale horror as he seemingly stared at something. Baum pushed his way towards the port bow. He got to within a few meters before the man let out a panicked gasp and scrambled away from the side. The ship jerked back to its original position, causing several crew members to fall flat on their faces or onto their backs. Before Baum could even question what the hell had caused that, he heard a meaty thud and a creaking of wood. He paused when he saw the entire crew began to freeze and slowly trail their heads over to the railings at the port bow where the anchor was. Baum followed their gazes and found himself similarly frozen stiff at the rather large hand which was currently wrapped around the railings. The grip tightened and caused the wood to crack and splinter before it began to exert itself and pull the owner up. The pirates watched with rapt attention as the stony visage of Havel dragged themselves onto the deck with a heavy thud which caused the whole ship to rock. Once the ship finally settled, the berserker looked around the crew and let out a low menacing growl as they stomped away from the spot they had boarded and over to the other edge of the ship. The pirates all unanimously, and silently, agreed to the idea that getting in the stone-armored giant's way wasn't the best idea they could come up with and was probably best to leave them be. L.P. Havel pointed towards the duo in the water and turned to the pirates, ABO, Ard. Oi. Pete stepped forwards with a heavy scowl. Who do you think you're the boss? Oh. Havel lashed out and clamped a heavy gauntlet around the man's shirt and dragged him across the deck, boost scraping against the surface with a whine before hoisting him up to be eye level with the helmet. Pete stared into the blackened ports of the berserker and suddenly found his sense of courage abandon him. I would very much like to apologize for my disrespectful tone and would be happy to carry out your orders to the best of my abilities, Master Stone Man. Pete rattled off without missing a beat, his eyes wide and his face ashen. It would be a great comfort to me if you did not also see fit to crush my head. Havel released a scoff and threw the man to the side. Noticing how everyone else was still stationary, he let out a menacing growl. It was like a chain reaction had gone off with all the pirates now sprinting about the deck shouting about getting a line out for the duo. Ritsuka squinted their eyes as a new figure emerged at the railings. Is that Havel? I believe it is, Senpai. Mash nodded her head. The berserker's appearance was quite distinctive and it was a small relief to know that they wouldn't have to use a command spell to try and rescue him from drowning. It also meant that they would probably be able to get off this dingy. Well, at least we know where he is. Ritsuka chuckled nervously and looked around. All that's missing is Archer and Ryder. Here. Ritsuka let out a slight squeal as Archer's dull voice called out behind him. The pair span around to see the tanned man with his head just above the surface of the water and a flat expression on his face. Boudica was floating next to him with her hair soaking and draped over her face like seaweed. Right then, Ritsuka nodded to them. Where's Ash? By the power of my command spell. Ritsuka intoned as the pattern on the back of his hand glowed. Ash, come to my position at once. There was a brief flash of light before the saber rematerialized just above the deck of the ship and then crashed into the wooden surface. Remaining flat on their back for a few moments, they abruptly jerked up and climbed to their feet. Ignoring the looks of concern he was being shown, Ash made his way to the port side and then clasped his hands on the railings. Then proceeded to do a remarkably good impression of a water tap as he vomited up a great deal of the clear liquid into the ocean. Ritsuka and Mash grimaced at the display and looked away. Most of the pirates remained stone-faced, considering they had seen such things before, and were still trying to wrap their heads around the literal sudden appearance of a man out of thin air. After 30 more seconds, the saber had managed to expel the last of the water from his lungs, coughing a few more times to be sure and then turned around to face the audience. I hate the ocean. Ritsuka couldn't fault him for that. Looking around, he noticed that all of the crew members of the pirate ship they had commandeered were all keeping their distance from them while looking rather nervous. Occasionally they directed worried glances towards the rather large form of Havel stood off to the side with their arms crossed. Ritsuka looked at the berserker and then back to them before he scratched his neck. So. He clapped his hands once, earning the attention of everyone on the boat. I'm Fujimaru Ritsuka and thanks for the rescue there. Nodding his head once, he tried his best to give a reassuring smile. Really appreciate it. Sorry for the whole, he waved his hand around, borrowing your boat. Quote. Fine. The pirate with the red cap stepped forwards, still looking nervous although he visibly held his composure better than the other men around him. Why you're, not gonna kill us now, or ya? No. Ritsuka denied instantly, eyes wide, no. We're not here to kill you. Oh thank God. The man let out a heavy sigh and visibly relaxed. Don't suppose we could convince you to, go then? He asked, already looking as though he knew what the answer to that question was going to be. Yeah, we kinda need a ship. Ritsuka replied with a slight shrug and a hapless look. This is kinda the only one we've seen, so. Fine. The man sighed, knew that would be the answer anyway. Excuse me. Mash called out and walked forwards. Do you happen to know the current situation here? Nah. He answered immediately, got no clue. About as lost as you look. We're trying to get back to Pirate Island when our compasses stopped working. Ritsuka gave a single blink. Pirate Island. He repeated in a flat tone of voice. The man nodded his head. "'S what we've been callin' it. He explained with a giddy expression. Good name, right? Quote. Shish, it, Havel grunted from where he was stood, the man visibly deflated at the dismissal. A thud attracted everyone's attention as Boudica swatted his arm with a frown on her face. There's no need to be rude about it. She scolded him. The berserker grunted and looked away. She sighed and looked back towards the pirates. Don't mind him, he's a bit grumpy is all. No problem, miss. One of the other pirates nodded their head, their eyes struggling to keep themselves fixed on her face and not slightly lower. Used to that sort of talk, right lads? He got murmurs of affirmation across the deck. Slightly tacky names aside. Ritsuka exhaled, crossing his arms and looking to the other servants, he gave a slight shrug to them. Good a place as any, right? Archer raised an eyebrow at him. It's your decision, master. Looking away he pursed his lips, although it isn't much of a choice right now. Pirate Island. Boudica parroted and shook her head, crossing her arms with a raising her eyebrows in bewilderment. Despite what she had said to Havel, she would admit it wasn't exactly a very good name either. Then looking towards Ash, the unkindled still with their back leaning against the railings, suppose we can expect a certain type of company, right? Don't know what a pirate is. Ash replied sullenly, staring at their sopping wet armor. This is uncomfortable. Boudica snorted as she wrung her hair, still looking as though she had just had a bucket of water poured over her person. Not that anyone surrounding her was complaining, with none of the pirates even making an attempt to hide their leers. Not that Boudica cared all that much, she'd been looked at far worse, and it was a similar case with the Iceni tribe. All you really had to do was establish a small hierarchy to follow. It inevitably meant that someone was going to get kicked somewhere, unfortunate, but that was life. It'll dry out, she assured him with an amused pat on the shoulder. Despite not being able to see his expression through the helmet, Boudica was able to tell that he was pouting at her much like a child would. So, Pirate Island then. Ritsuka shrugged. Let's set sail. Well, if y'all ain't gonna have giant kill us. The pirate shrugged. I'm Bomb. First officer of the boss. Where's the boss? Mash asked hopefully. Pirate Island. Well, guess our goals align, kind of. Ritsuka helpfully supplied with an optimistic tone of voice. How far away are we? Still no clue. Bomb answered before they put on a thoughtful face. Probably a couple hours, half a day. I'll call Chaldea. Ritsuka whispered to Mash. You keep an eye on them. Why? Mash whispered back. Didn't they said they'd help? Ritsuka stared at her with a blank face for a few moments before he replied. Mash. They're pirates. I'm a trusting kind of guy, but it's pirates. He answered as if it was obvious. Their whole thing is stealing stuff, although they haven't tried yet, so they might not try at all. Just a precaution, I suppose. All right, then. Mash nodded her head and turned to look at the other servants, all of whom were in various states of idleness as they waited for new orders. Roman. Director. Ritsuka tapped his communicator, the button on his wrist flashed and the blue screen popped into life. Anyone? Hey. Fujimaru-kun. Romani's face popped up on the communicator. A forced smile was present upon it as the director stood just behind him with a mask of professionalism. So. Ray shift successful then. No issues at all, right? The way he phrased it was less like a question and more like cry for help. No doubt Roman was aware that they had manifested in a rather unfortunate situation and was looking to give himself an out by relying on Ritska. While Ritska would have been more than willing to try and at least attempt to cover for the doctor, Mash wasn't quite as forgiving. Ash-san nearly drowned. She appeared over Ritska's shoulder with a clear look of disapproval on her face. If I had not protected Senpei when we hit the water, he would have been seriously injured. Romani bit his lip and clenched his eyes shut as the director's head slowly turned and aimed a blank look at the back of his head. Her arms slowly uncrossed themselves from in front of her and fell at her sides. The only indication of anything being wrong was the twitch of her brow. Romani. Her voice was cold enough that Ritska got shivers and he wasn't even in the room. How high did they materialize? Are we talking the average or the? There was a difference. Romani looked like he was about to be fed to a woodchipper. The expression on the director's face slowly morphed into one that looked as though it was actually beginning to humor the idea. Well. Fujimaru-kun and Mash materialized around 200 meters above sea level. Havel was 300 meters. Romani. Why yes. It is only the lack of other medical personnel in Chaldea that is currently keeping me from turning you into a patient. Her threat was toneless and yet that somehow made it all the more horrifying. If I discover that this is user error and not a glitch in the rayshift system, then I will rescind that courtesy and simply have Sigward heal people with his magic. Do you understand? Yes. Romani squeaked. Good. Her eyes flickered back over to Ritska. Idiocy aside, Romani flinched. What is your current situation? We landed near a boat. Ritska explained. We're currently borrowing it from the pirates. Pirates. Yes. I see. She flatly remarked. What else? Ritska wet his lips and did his best to compose himself. He knew exactly how this next sentence was going to sound to anyone. The pirates are taking us to Pirate Island. SNRK. Romani barely managed to prevent himself from giving a full laugh before the director's glare fell on him. The doctor looked away and bit their lip to prevent any more sound from coming out before she slowly turned her head back towards Ritska and Mash. A flash of incredulity swept across her face. Pirate Island. If it makes you feel better. Mash was desperately sending a pleading look at Ritska to get him to stop. Unfortunately he missed it considering she wasn't directly in front of him at the time. I think it's a tacky name too. It doesn't. Olga responded. Is there something to expect at the destination? Pirate Island. Romani supplied. Olga now looked very tempted to punch him. The destination. She went on. Is there something there, yes or no? Well, Bomb has a boss there so he just wanted to get back in its land so we figured there would be someone we could ask. Ritska shrugged, turning around. Hey, Bomb. Yeah. The pirate called back from the wheel, looking somewhat uncaring at being called out. What's your boss called anyway? Francis Drake. Bomb boasted, best pirate ever. Huh. Ritska turned back to the screen. There you have it. We're going to. He paused and looked over his shoulder. Wait. The Francis Drake. I don't think they had a the in front of their name, last I checked. Bomb scratched his chin. Doesn't sound like something they'd have. Ritska turned back to see Olga and Romani staring with wide eyes. Would they be a servant? No. Romani answered immediately. Francis Drake shouldn't be dead for another 20 or so years. That means this is the real, living Francis Drake. He excitedly went on. They've got to be one of the most famous seafaring captains in history. And it seems far too telling for them to be present in a singularity. Olga carried on with a nod of her head, cupping her chin. It seems as though your objective is obvious for now. Allowing the real Francis Drake to die would be a catastrophe and certainly worthy of a singularity. For now I would recommend you meet up with them. Alright. Ritska nodded and looked over his shoulder. Hey, Bomb. Yeah. The man called back. Can we meet them? Sure. He replied with a shrug. If the boss don't like you, they'll just sort ya out anyway. Ritska figured he'd rather not be sort out, but it was something. You seem to be taking this quite well. Archer dryly remarked from behind the pirate. The man shrugged his shoulders in response. When y'ave seen giant sea monsters in a whole island blow up, ya tend to stop bein' surprised by things fallen from the sky. Bomb chuckled with a shake of their head. Besides, still scared shitless of the big guy. Eyes flickering over to Havel near the center of the ship, stood still like a statue and just glaring at anyone who came close. HMPH. Archer huffed and walked away. By the way, Bomb called out to him. Archer paused and looked over his shoulder at the man. You ain't one of them Afrikaans have been hernin' about, right? Heard they had dark skin and all. Archer blinked once. No. I'm not. Figured. Bomb shrugged. Just looks like a good tan. Pete once had one of those when he fell asleep in the crow's nest. He sniffed once. Well, don't sick giant on us and we'll be cordial enough. Archer raised a single eyebrow at him, regarding the man with thin lips before he turned away and made his way back onto the main deck and towards his master. He passed a glance with Ash as he walked across the deck in the direction of the nearest door. He wasn't the only one, as the red-haired rider also spied his retreating form. Where are you going, by the way? Boudica called out to Ash as she noticed him moving towards one of the doors into the ship's interior. Ash paused and turned around. Armor's wet, chonging it up. He answered. Boudica gave him an amused smile as she crossed her arms. What? It's wet. You know you could just turn into spirit form and, Ash shut the door behind him, cutting off whatever she was going to say and leaving her there with her mouth slightly agape. Boudica let out a sigh, shaking her head in exasperation. Children. Never any patience to them. Archer paid the conversation little mind as he continued on his way towards his master. The boy looked as though they were finishing up a conversation with Chaldea, likely relating to the little tidbit that they were dealing with Francis Drake as well. Of course, if it was 1573, then this would be the living Francis Drake rather than a heroic spirit, which likely made their survival a priority. It also made determining the center of the singularity a little bit easier. Ink'd look quite good in a pirate hat though. His features instantly faltered as he managed to capture the tail end of the conversation. Also help me blend in, you know. Ritska argued with a slightly hopeful tone to his voice. Yes. The director's dry voice would have made a desert envious, because nothing screamed subtly like wearing a bright white mystic coat in conjunction with a stupid hat. The way in which Ritska flinched made it obvious that he was a bit saddened by the answer. If you want to embarrass yourself, fine. But do not do so under the pretense that you're making a smarter decision than you are. A sigh was audible as Archer came to a stop behind them. Was there anything else? It seems as though they're missing an island. Archer picked that moment to speak up. Ritska and Mash turned to face him with food tilting their head in questioning. The one called Bomb made mention of sea monsters as well. Any idea why they're missing an island? Ritska asked with visible intrigue. They said it blew up. The intrigue was gone and replaced with puzzlement. Blew up. You mean like a volcano? Possibly. Romani replied in a thoughtful tone of voice. With the rampant mana in the air as a result of the Holy Grail, it could have caused some destabilization in the ley lines. He offered, could also have been some other phenomena. Or it could have been a battle between servants. Archer pointed out the other alternative, strong ones too, if there is an entire island missing. Olga pursed her lips and nodded grimly. There is that possibility to consider. It would be best that you remain on guard, although it is entirely possible that the destruction of an entire island led to the elimination of both attacking parties. Or the other is wounded. Archer carried on. Regardless, there is the issue of sea monsters. Likely a similar case to the wyverns. Romani answered that time with a frown. Summoned via the power of the Holy Grail are attracted to the singularity itself, although with so many different types of sea monsters you'll be hard-pressed for choice which ones you're dealing with. What? Like the Kraken? Ritska joked, then noticed the way in which both Romani and the director remained silent. Wait, that's real too. It was one of the last monstrous beasts still until the late 18th century. Romani dismissed. Although it was hunted down pretty soon after it came to the association's notice, the fact loads of people still believed in the superstition meant it was allowed in existence. The discovery of the giant squid kind of helped curb that. That's a heck of a bombshell to just drop on me like that. Ritska blinked, then paled as they turned their head towards the ocean. I'm not gonna have to, you know. Huh. Romani blinked and then shook his head. Oh, no. The Kraken wouldn't be anywhere near you. So you're fine. He paused before continuing on. Also, it really was just a large squid, unlike something like the Hydra, which was said to have a terrible poison and immense regenerative properties. So. No Kraken then. Ritska let out an audible sigh of relief, thank goodness for that. Suppose I'll have to worry about sea monsters later then. Maybe. Romani shrugged, hard to say, you haven't been here all that long so I wouldn't be able to comment on it. Probably best to keep a lookout all the same though, right? Alright. Ritska nodded. I'll focus on getting to Pirate Island then. He paused and shook his head. No, that just sounds really tacky, doesn't it? Kind of endearing though. Romani pointed out with a wry smile. Like a storybook for children. Ritska looked around at the individuals on the boat and then back to Romani with a raised eyebrow. The doctor let out a small breath. I know that there really aren't any children, but you're young, right? I'm 17, Roman. I'm not that young. If you're quite finished. Olga cut in sharply. It would be best you focus yourself entirely onto your mission. Be sure to contact Chaldea again when you have rendezvoused with Francis Drake. Understood, Director.